I'm going to make you, oh, it hit recording again. Paul, Tennessee, we welcome you to this virtual event. I'm Robin Thomas. I'm a ruling elder and co-executive presbyter for the Presbytery of Middle Tennessee. We're excited to hear from Dr. Thompson this morning and are grateful to our Committee on Leadership Excellence and its chair, Dr. Aaron Stauffer, for organizing this event. Let us begin our time together with prayer. Speak to us, Lord. We are your people, and we are listening. Across these electronic transmissions, through the thoughts and giftedness of Dr. Thompson, by the sparks of imagination ignited by your spirit moving among us, enable us to remember this hour as a holy moment. Equip us for today's challenges and tomorrow's sacred worship with the inspiration of your living word. In Jesus Christ, amen. Aaron?
Well, good morning, all. I'm Aaron Stauffer, the chair of the Committee on Leadership Excellence, and I'm really excited and thankful to have you all here. We should have a really great time together. We'll be hearing from Dr. Lisa Thompson, who will speak for a little bit, and then we'll have a time of community conversation guided by Dr. Thompson. So we'll break you out into breakout rooms then. My role right now is just to introduce Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson is she's a native of Cedar Grove, North Carolina. I first started working with her when she was a professor at Union Theological Seminary. And now she is the associate professor and the Cornelius Vanderbilt Chancellor Faculty Fellow of Black Homiletics and Liturgic at Vanderbilt Divinity School in the Graduate Department of Religion. Dr. Thompson is a well-known writer and speaker on matters of faith and pastoral leadership and homiletics. She has two books. The first, it was Ingenuity, Preaching as an Outsider, and that came out in 2018. And the most recent one is Preaching the Headlines, which is what she'll speak from today. Her talk today will cover issues ranging to faith in the headlines, and specifically here questions of pastoral leadership in the church, broadly understood. But without further ado, Dr. Thompson, please take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you so much, Dr. Stauffer, for the introduction, and to Robin Thomas, co-executive presbyter of the Middle Tennessee Presbytery. I am just grateful to be with you all. And Aaron is correct. We began working together when we were together at Union, and many of days he supported functions just like this. So it is ironic to be in this context with him here. But there were many things I could not have done without his support and help. And so now it's great to have him as a colleague. It is a pleasure to be with you all this morning. And I want to thank you for taking time on the Saturday morning to be in conversation about what it means to pursue life and what it means to pursue the life of faith in the world at hand, to be honest. What I'm about to say will sound a bit counterintuitive for anyone who has written a book or writes a book, but in earnest, my goal is that we all eventually work myself out of a job, and we all eventually work preaching the headlines off the shelf, and there be not a need for it. So I just want to give you a background to the project a bit. I began the work in preaching the headlines about 10 years ago. And I deeply wish it were not still relevant and needed. However, the state of our world in an ongoing and persistent way reminds us that in conversations ahead, the conversations ahead of us remain not only relevant, but most urgent to an extent. So I am particularly concerned about these conversations for people of faith. So let me begin here in terms of what are we focusing on today? I thought, well, what would make a conversation worth our time today in particular? And for me, it became apparent that it's more so about thinking of leadership and the everyday faithful, right? So this idea of leadership and the everyday faithful. Is what we're going to focus on today. So let me say a word about what on earth I'm trying to get at here with this idea of leadership and the everyday faithful. And Instead of dealing with the specific nuts and bolts of the book per se, I hope our conversation models the concerns of the book instead of going through the tidbits of the book. To those ends, I'll say the book is not simply concerned with preaching, nor preaching the headlines, nor is it for preachers alone, but it's a resource most concerned with equipping and instigating, if not agitating, communities of faith to be more ethical, to be more responsible, to be more just action-oriented folk in the wider world. On the grandest and the smallest scale, in everyday life, day to day, wherever we may find ourselves, anyone who is interested has the capacity to be an influencer or leader in the role faith plays in their community and the wider world. In other words, we're thinking about leading from where we are. So to be clear, I come to this conversation with some assumptions this morning. One of those assumptions is that people of faith, being conscientious participants in our day-to-day realities, is not an option, but instead it's a mandate. Secondly, this mandate is not just because it's the heartfelt human thing to do, which honestly, I wish and hope, and it should be enough just to be the human thing to do. It seems feasible that we could move people to being, thinking, and doing by building bridges through empathy and relationship towards spirit-filled and flesh-covered beings. But interesting enough, history has proven that some type of static interference occurs that prevents us from the ability to perceiving another as worthy of empathy and a relational bridge. So our relational participation in the world is a mandate because this is a non-option that's at the core of Christianity. Now, if that were only enough, the non-option at the core of Christianity. But even this gets us into a bit of trouble because the third and final assumption shaping what lies ahead of us this morning is that there is an urgency to claim a compass or a guide for our participation in the world as a mandate of faith. This urgency primarily exists because we have experienced what forsaking our responsibility in the world around us produces. We've also experienced how our contortion of faith around our egos, seeds of hatred, have created troubling distortions in our relationships one to another and our relationships to the wider creation. In very concrete ways, the veneer of faith has led to war, human death, the extinction of natural resources, the disregard for children. I mean, our lists can go on and on. Therefore, it's not about if it is significant for people of faith to be concerned about the world around us, nor why, but it's the how. How do we ourselves, or how do we help others increase in the capacity to shift our postures toward the transformative possibilities of loving God and neighbor? The aim of such postures is faithfulness in the everydayness. That's the aim of these postures. How are we faithful in the everyday and ordinary stuff of life? And because our everyday circumstances shift and fluctuate, intuiting what love of God and love of neighbor requires of us in the very present times requires a type of nimbleness with an attentiveness to the particulars of our faith traditions and life. This attentiveness is faithfulness in the most ordinary circumstances. Neither life nor faith traditions are static. We are presently co-creating realities in our homes, in our communities, and in our wider world. And what we do today ripples forward into what is possible or what we might inherit tomorrow. So the questions before us are, what traditions do we want to leave behind? And which ones do we want to give forward? What realities of our world do we want to leave behind? And which ones do we want to give forward? Our faith traditions are living ones. The very reason that they are living is because we practice them. We carry them forward. They live through us. And indeed, they are shaped by our fingerprints, our intonations, every time we touch them, sing them, pray them, and live in their name. They are shaped and reshaped. And we happen to live these faith commitments out within a wider world, which we also shape for better or for worse. So a word here about leading from where we are. Leading from where we are assumes that we are all have a responsibility to be engaged persons of faith and contributors within our communities. We often will quickly say, oh, yes, 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 of course. I need to serve where I am, be where I am, contribute how I can. And I want to say yes, yes, and more. Leading from where we are means that we become more curious about what is happening in the space before us, what is contributing to what is happening there, and how what we claim as people of faith contributes to what's happening right there in that moment. But we also understand that whatever is happening in this moment, in this very moment, is connected to what is happening down my block, across the neighborhood, beyond my state borders, and clear across the ocean. Very practically speaking, this assumes we ask better and more critical questions of the world around us, of scripture, of sermons, and of our traditions. The push here is for us to claim the ability to think critically about, imagine, and pursue life-saving transformations of the world at hand. And life-saving is not hypothetical. Salvation becomes just as tangible as it is spiritual, and we become just as responsible for it as co-participants with God. In this regard, we must all commit to greater humility and risk-taking. We do not give answers per se, preacher, recognized leader or not, because we do not have all the answers. We learn to pursue our questions and hunches together. And we hold each other accountable for opening space for exploration. In this space, we judge for ourselves together. And in this space, we access what our capacity for thinking, being, and acting out of more life-sustaining containers. These are matters of relationship, self-leadership, and communal volition. So I'll say a word here about then what does it mean to be co-creators of faith and life? People become nervous at this point when I begin talking, because we know humans are just as messy and troublesome as we can be. We come with personalities and quirks and proclivities. You get 10 people in a room, you have 13 different opinions and preferences. But on the other hand, there's something else. There is a part of wonder and of who we are that also holds us accountable in those proclivities and our messiness. Because when we get 10 people in a room, we also get 10 journeys in a room and 10 different experiences of lived wisdom in a room. And we are reminded that this thing called life is so much bigger than any one of us alone. At the intersections of struggle, wonder, joy, and sorrow, and their conflicts is where something more emerges. It emerges as we dare to take a risk on each other. I've become convinced that the dynamics and relationships we've created one to another, our unwillingness to ask questions, our insistent need to be right and absolute, reflects the dynamics we've created around our relationship with God. What does that mean? Only when we dare to believe that God is big enough for our questions, our wondering, and our willingness to get it wrong in the name of getting it a little closer to better. I'm not yet ready to say we can get it all the way right. Only in that realm will we believe our communities are big enough to work together. When we believe that God is big enough for wonder, for questions, for doubt, uncertainty, and risk-taking, then I am convinced we also, in community with one another, will do the wondering, the risk-taking, and the pursuit of possibility. Because what we're after is not consensus and full agreement in these conversations and the life of faith. We are after mutual accountability. And this accountability is to something that is quite substantive, clear, and most radical if we allow it to be. This is a mutual accountability to what lies at the core of the Christian gospel. It is a radical one and a risky one if we dare to take it seriously. And it is an accountability to what we claim we believe. At all times, it means we err on the side of love of God and love of neighbor in the most vibrant, radical, and embodied forms. This is not that warm, fuzzy commercial, I love Hallmark, but not even the Hallmark kind of love. It's about living mindfully. To live in awareness of God requires uncompromising effort in living mindful of my neighbor. We hold without compromise to what we have long professed as the gospel claim, that we might have life and have it more abundantly. But here's the catch: life more abundantly is not hypothetical. Life more abundant is tangible in the ability of people actually being able to flourish without compromise right here and right now. Therefore, the sustaining of life has the final word right here and right now. That's what we become mutually accountable to. We become mutually accountable to the gospel claim and all this uncertainty that surrounds us. Because we can live with tension, we can live with unease, we can live with discomfort. But what we know for sure in these days and these times, we cannot live with demise, deterioration, premature death, and the like of safety for anyone. Being co-creators of life and faith means we claim our state of relationships right here and right now. And as a flicker, we claim them as a flicker of the transforming realm of God to come, or that we hope is to come, and that is the realm in which we are participating. So then what does this mean about our traditions and our faith traditions? If sustaining all creation and responding out of a commitment to a radical love practice matters most to God, then dare we say this should be what matters most to us, to the community of faith, to the communities in which we live, the communities out of which we live. It may challenge us to refrain from holding on to traditions, rituals, and values that were once a part of our journey, but will not sustain our futures as communities of faith. Clarity about what matters most helps the tradition of faith remain viable into its futures, into our futures, the ones we want to co-create. The alternative, I've often said, is succumbing to the death or irrelevance by dwelling on what matters least of all. Approaching our traditions as living ones does not diminish the role of Scripture. Instead, it recognizes its role in the lives of listeners and relies on it. We work with Scripture's recognized authority to do something more life-sustaining than what we have done in the past. Knowing that Scripture is touchable, invites our questions, and relies on our observations is what retains its ongoing sacredness and holiness and its nature as a living and relevant document, a fresh word for today. Well, if we're going to think about traditions as living, as moving, things that we pass on and will inherit in our future, it's worth thinking about, well, what does it require to do that work? For me, part of that work is doing faith and doing faith talk better. If sustaining all of creation and responding out of a commitment to a radical love practice matters most to God, and I'm saying it's what matters most to us, attending to the fullness of life on the ground and its sustenance requires doing better faith talk. Doing better faith talk means being confrontational in the best ways possible. We must confront our use of core strands of Christian traditions that actually perpetuate the injustices and hate and deteriorating life circumstances that are anti-gospel. We can readily see it in history, how easy it is to influence social order by coding it with our Christian veneers. This dynamic is in work and assumptions about gender and ethnic, racial superiority. This dynamic is present in slavery and human trafficking in ancient and more contemporary times. This dynamic hovers around everything from the Crusades to genocides to the denial of rights to people seeking general physical safety and equal pay. In short, one spin on the story of faith can lead to complete demise in the world around us, while another spin on the story of faith could create so much more possibility, life-giving, life-sustaining possibilities in the world around us. We seek to do faith talk better in order to better translate the matters of faith to everyday folk of faith. The how of these conversations and the work ahead of us comes through revisiting the faith stories that we've inherited. And put another way, we revisit these faith stories and ask, what if it's not just this, but it's this and that? What if sin is not just this thing, but it's this thing and that thing? What if salvation is not just this, but it's this and that? So what I'm saying is we must do the work of doing sacred storytelling better in order to be the everyday faithful in our day-to-day interactions. Living as the everyday faithful assumes, crisis or not, we live out faith as though our lives depend on it. This is not about life in a metaphorical sense, as if it were removed from the body. It's about life in its fleshy fullness, body, mind, and soul as one. Life's possibilities require the precursor of our sheer survival. Life abundant requires the precursor of survival. And anything that prevents or preempts life survival closes off its abilities to flourish. So the question before us and before others as the everyday faithful remain, what aspects of the world today do we want to leave behind? And which ones do we want to give forward? What traditions do we want to leave behind? And which ones do we want to give forward? And where might we begin today, right where we are? So at this moment, I would like to open our community conversation and thinking about these very matters. We've established some breakout rooms so we can at least have smaller conversations at first, and then we'll come back. And if it's okay, Dr. Stauffer, do you mind dropping the handout in the chat for us? Okay.
Yes, I'll do that right now. I'm also creating new breakout rooms.
Okay. Okay. If it helps, I've already created them. Okay. And I'm going to ask for one person in each group to simply be a timekeeper. Okay. So we're going to do 3 10-minute stints. So a timekeeper. I'm going to ask one person to maybe be a note taker. You will not have to report back all that came, but just if there's anything you want to gather up for the group. And for one person to be the one who's responsible for downloading the handout if no one else can download it. Okay. One person to be I'm responsible to be the tech savvy person in the room. What will happen when we go into our groups is that you'll see on the handout a version of these questions, and then you'll each have a slide that comes after that, a document that comes out of that. And I want us to begin with this simple first question in the group. As you think about the visuals that are before you, one group will be the Faith is Fleshy group, the other group will be the Lament naming for accountability group, and the other group will name you the communion group. But I simply want you all to take a moment to look at the images before you, to look at the slide before you, and contend with this first question. What aspects of the world today do we want to leave behind? Do we not want to give forward? and which ones do we want to gift forward? I'm just going to ask that we refrain from trying to make final conclusions or wide sweeping generalizations, to just be honest. If you had to build a bridge with your heart to what you see in front of you or what else these images make you think about, what do we want to leave behind and what do we want to take forward? Okay.
Dr. Thompson, I'm having just a little bit of trouble of uploading this. What I would suggest is that if we break out into groups, I can then drop that. I'm just going to upload it through Google Drive, and I can join each group and drop it into their chat.
Okay, that
Yeah,
sounds
I'm
perfect.
sorry. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. We'll let everyone get settled, and then I will give a warning when it's time to come back. So we'll begin with this first question. What aspects of the world do we want to leave behind, and which ones do we want to give forward?
I'm sorry about this, Lisa. For some reason, I couldn't grab it from my desktop. So I'm just doing this through Google Drive right now.
It's the same thing that happened to me. It's no worry. I think it's how the Zoom may be set up.
Yeah.
And I should have renamed the groups, but it's okay. Let's see. Looks like we still have more people who need to be assigned.
I know some of them. There's Ray, and I don't know who Molly is. Okay, I'm gonna I'm gonna join each group and move them.
Aaron, if we could take, and then I won't notify, or actually I can broadcast the message. How about that?
Okay.
But just as you join, we'll take one, in order sequence, like faith is fleshy, 2 will be lament, communion will be 3,
Okay.
and I will broadcast the message.
Cool. Thanks. Give me a second. Finally went through. All right. Now I'm
Did it? Okay. Good. You did better than me.
Well, I'll be back.
Okay. I'm hoping these are folks who maybe just Robin did not want to join the room and are not having difficulty joining their room. Robin, are you okay if we start the clock about 11:34 is when Aaron had time to drop in? Okay.
Yeah, so we do a 3-minute now.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was wondering if you were okay if we began the 30 minutes, probably about 11:34.
Oh, of course.
Okay. I
Yeah.
just, as Aaron was having time to situate.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay.
So one group done, another 2 more.
Okay. If I can figure it out, Aaron, I'll join you. I'll try to get into room 3. Okay.
Thanks. I even tried just to do it again, even once I got it through Google Drive to share, and it still didn't work. So I'm just dropping links.
Okay. I'll go into room 3 then. How about that?
Okay. Well, I can do it quickly just because I've got the same link, if that's okay. Okay. Now I just want to, did you say 10 minutes? Is that right?
I did.
That's fine. I will broadcast then to everybody. I just want to make sure the minutes.
Just on the first question, and and then I'll give them the second one. Let's see if I can pull something else myself.
Okay.
I know, Aaron, take a breath.
Well, it's so, I just,
I know.
it's like all I want to do is share a link and it's.
I know. I think there is something that happens when the Zoom account is connected to a virtual drive as opposed to the actual hard drive. Something kicks in, it doesn't allow it.
Yeah, and it was all this sorts of, but whatever. But yeah, all right, well, that worked. I thought this was, I don't think I've ever seen you give a talk before, but that was awesome.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you usually always you used to just like, yeah.
I just read your work, you know?
Resources.
Yeah, I've just read it, and so it's like, I mean, obviously, but I just like, I think it's such a good. Well, I think one of the reasons I found it awesome was just there's lots of overlaps with my own in different fields, like my own interest, like lived theology, like, yeah, like social gospel message of like has to be social and personal, like, So it's just like, yeah, that's right. Like, this is homiletics. Cool.
Well, I hope the tenor feels right, because I also thought, I didn't just grab and paste. So I wanted to try to rewrite for the folk in front of us. So we'll see.
I think so.
Yeah, you all know your audience better than I do.
Well, to be honest, this is my first event with this presbytery. So Robin, you maybe have more of a better sense of what we've got. I mean, I know the presbytery pretty well.
Right, right. I would think it's a good split. There's half of our presbytery and half of other folks, because the invite went out to Vanderbilt folks and also, whoever wanted to join other presbyteries. I see a couple folks from other presbyteries on here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think it's a great representation.
And Robin, how long have you been with Middle Tennessee Presbyterian?
Not long. It'll be
No.
3 years in April. And of course, we didn't even get through our first year when COVID hit. So we haven't had many in-person events since we've been here. So yeah, that's been the challenge.
I think the last time, Robin, that we were together in person was like 3 days after the tornado, which was the start of COVID too.
Yes.
And
I met with you for coffee at Dose. Was that?
That's right. And
yeah.
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, and this is a great response from you. Like, I went to hug you and you're like, well, actually, this COVID thing. And I was like,
okay?
I was like, COVID? I was like, what are you talking about? It's like, we just had a tornado go through.
I need a hug.
Yes.
So
and I'm a huggy person, but I was just trying to be respectful to, is this okay?
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, now I'm kind of like, absolutely, it was an entirely appropriate response, but it was just like, what a start to two plus years.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Yeah.
How are you feeling, Lisa? Are there other things that we want to broadcast to the group, or what do you think?
I want to actually send them a passage of scripture, so that now, because the question is always, oh, we have these headlines and what we're going to do. What about, this has nothing to do with scripture. So I'm actually going to drop Judges 19 down in there. I want to put the Bachepta story in there, and just to ask them to think alongside the tradition with now what questions do they have of their tradition?
Yeah.
Considering these things. So we'll go to the second question, but I want to drop 11, 28 through 40 down.
Okay. That's great.
So I think I'm good to give them, tell them they have one more minute on this question.
I think so.
And I will try to pull this from a different location. I will say this is also the first time I think I've managed a virtual workshop since the start of COVID.
Well,
as opposed to class every week.
Yeah, right. Well, and I was actually thinking, in a way, this is a great experiment for the lifelong learning program. Let me see. Yeah, just because Shane rejoined, and I'm going to move him to group 3.
Yeah.
I think he moved.
Okay. Never tried dropping a link into the broadcast message. Let's see if it works.
My only fear is that I don't think it's people are able to click on it. It's not hyperlinked.
Oh,
Do you want to paste that in the chat here, and then I can go to the groups again?
mhm. Do you want the chat? Do you want the text or the link, Aaron?
A link.
A link.
A link. Even when I gave people a file, they still asked for a link. So
Okay.
like,
Well, I
okay.
never know how tech savvy folk are, so that's why I like to prepare them all for both.
I know, right? All right, I'll hit
Oh, yeah.
group 1. And just so I'm clear, they're considering this alongside which question?
What number 2? What aspects of the tradition do they want to let go? Aaron, I'm going to drop a new link because that was the Anglicanized version of the NRSV.
You're great. I'll triple check this. Yeah, perfect. I love it. All right, I'll be back.
So Lisa, what's the difference of those two? Because you were saying,
I really don't know. I went into the English version. That's why I thought I was just aiming for the NRSV.
okay,
And that's why I thought, oh wait, I don't know how that little A showed up on the side of it. So I thought,
gotcha. Okay, I thought
I'm
it was
not
a
sure
different.
what's in that
version.
version. But
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I thought, wait, I'm not sure what's the difference in that translation. I do know it's associated with the Anglican Church. So I'm not as
Okay.
it's fine, but I can't go any further into the description. I'm sure it would have been fine to let it live, but then I thought, I know the NRSV version well, I know the NIV version well, I don't know that other one.
Okay.
I could just look it up quickly.
Hey, Aaron, should we stop record? Oh, he's gone again. I'm just wondering, should we just stop recording?
Pause.
Recording in progress.
We almost have everyone. Well, welcome back, everyone. One of my philosophies of groups and group discussions is that I do not surveil them. So I'm not coming back for a report out to say, oh, no, tell us everything that happened. I'm more so curious about process. And did anything come up for you all in the process that you think is worth noting aloud? Especially when you think about this dynamic of what does it mean to transport maybe the process of a conversation or being open to conversation in your actual communities of faith? Is there anything about this process that you want to flag? And if I were to ask the question a different way, I'm not afraid of silence. I'm a teacher. If I were to ask the question a different way, was there anything that was particularly difficult in the conversation? Or to try to think around the matters that we were thinking around?
I know I struggled with the connection between the themes and the headlines and the pictures. I really struggled with that connection.
Yeah. Do you want to say more there?
We had conversation about we had the confession and communion. We talked about, did it mean communion with our direct communion with God? Did it mean the Lord's Supper? We were just trying to get those connections of not only just the thematic words, but then it was really it was a stretch for me, I know personally, to try to connect those thematic words with the headlines.
Okay, so you were so this idea of automatically already trying to connect the words to the headlines, was there a possibility, did you all find any possibility, did you try to separate them at all to say, if I just think about these headlines, or just what comes up, right? So they were supposed to be kind of like opportunities to help us percolate, but what comes up when I see these images? Were you able to do that apart from trying to think about that term?
I think we kind of stuck with unpacking the terms and starting there.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's good to hear. And when you started talking about communion, did you all come up with, what did you all come up with? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to for the group, but what happened in that process? Did you get, I don't want to say competing things, but multiple stories, multiple ideas about what it meant?
I would say that multiple ideas. We all came at it from different directions, and that was good. It's appreciate, you appreciate hearing how people hear words and what they mean.
I think this is one of the important things for me to highlight here. So when near the end where I'm talking about doing faith talk better, part of that doing faith talk better is interrogating the claims that we make in the name of faith. So we often use these words or use these practices like communion, salvation, reconciliation, redemption. The push here in thinking about everyday faithfulness is to get clear about, well, what do we actually mean by that? Because it can function in two ways. In one way, it can mean a lot of nothing, that there's just a term hanging out there. Often, whether it's preaching or talking to people separately who aren't even preaching, but just having the conversation, I often say, but what do you mean by communion? What does it look like in this moment? Or what does it even mean? And if you could, can you tell me about it without using the word? Can you tell me what redemption is without using the word redemption? So there's one way in which it can mean nothing, right? So there's not a clear meaning of anything. And then in another way in our communities, it often functions just like your conversation did. There are lots of competing, right? So we take, instead of one kind of larger, consistent idea of what this thing means, we're creating hodgepodges. It's a little this, it's a little that, it's a little this, but we might not have a consistent portrait, or there might even be contradictory things that lie there. So thank you for bringing that up. I just wanted to say that is a very part of the work we're after here. And I think instead of just having these words out there circulating, really thinking about, well, what do the claims of faith that we say actually mean to us in the everyday? One of the things that I did not do, and I will try to sketch quickly here for you, in thinking about those individual slides and what you saw happening there, and saying, well, it's very hard for us to think about the connections between these headlines and some of the words on the page. In other contexts, when I'm talking about these matters, I often say that if we talk about this reality of being attentive to life, where it happens and how it happens, then we also have to think about life in its fullness on the ground, and then how that percolates up in our conversations. Part of that work is translating how life in our everyday conversations translates back to our conversations around faith. And so, for instance, for those of you who are in the Faith is Fleshy group, And we began with this idea of sustaining life is that thing that's most important. Well, life doesn't happen outside of the body. If we're thinking about it actually being a tangible thing and life abundant being a tangible thing, it means it must be a tangible thing for actual people moving about in the room or moving about in our midst. And when we look at some of the wider conflicts and tensions in our world, this is exactly where our conversations usually break down, where we try to talk about the tensions that arise by what it means to live in the body. This is what we talk about when we get to conversations about racism, sexism, ableism, all these things that happen when suddenly a body shows up. And now we're reading people, interpreting folk, lifestyle situations are mediated based on how I show up in my body. And as I think about building bridges to those conversations, what you all don't see on the slide there, say, well, if we really dig behind our faith tradition, Christian faith traditions, what does it tell us about, how or why we might attend to the body? Lo and behold, the Christian faith tradition is fleshy at its core. There's an entire story about a God coming to us in a body and living amongst us, and not just darting the body as something that's separate from spirit, but it's actually body, flesh, and spirit right there together. How much more valuable a value can be placed on a body than the holy coming incarnate in a body, right? So the idea of thinking then, how do we build bridges to thinking about the significance and why we attend to what deals death in the everyday life for a tradition that claims that we want life and life more abundant. Well, we have to attend to how life is deteriorating. So those are, thinking about how do we build those bridges between faith talk and the language of the everyday world, and why it actually matters to people of faith. I'll hold off on tracing through the other two, because we do want to know, is there anything where you think about action, like where you can start today about what we might want to leave behind and take forward? Did you all come up with anything particular for you or your context of ministry that you might want to try out or that seems feasible? Was it impossible to identify a practice?
No, several of the folks in our group talked at length about the need for self-care today, especially in ministry, and that there are everyday things we can be doing now to activate that.
Okay. Yeah. As you actually might need to attend to your own body and the reality that, life is fragile in a different way for you right now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything else come up?
Scott, if you're talking, you're muted there.
One thing that came up in our group was just the church's ability to lament with its own people, but what about the people around us? Yeah. And that kind of made me think that, that like our deacons are very good about caring for their flocks, but there's a middle school right across the street from the church. There's a fire station, and I think maybe I should call the principal and see how can we connect with the people in the middle school and across the street at the fire station. Yeah. Why don't I call the fire chief and reach out and just put into practice what we already do pretty well for our own people, but make that apply to the community, not just those who walk inside our church doors.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. This is kind of core of when we're speaking about these ideas of what seems like it's so insignificant, but really has the possibility to be a transformative action, like just building bridges and making the human connection, and realizing that ministry happens well beyond the door. And it is kind of how do we embody this posture towards the wider world? And there's opportunity right across the street. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm mindful that we also wanted to leave time for you all to, if you all had any questions or comments for me, whether it's from the conversation this morning or, the earlier talk this morning, or even the group process, or even if you want me to clarify anything that was a part of the, even your group work or kind of small group discussions. Aaron, I'll hand it over to you to moderate.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Thompson. And Scott, I mean, I put this in the chat. I think your question is especially relevant to churches all across Presbyterian Middle Tennessee, those in small towns and in larger Nashville, area that are no longer commuter churches, or no longer neighborhood, but are instead commuter churches. What does it mean to have the church that is more of a, within the Catholic, framework here, Roman Catholic, a parish, where the church is responsible to the neighborhood directly around that? I think that's often how it started, but has, because a number of reasons, changed. But yeah, let's open it up. Questions, comments, concerns you have for Dr. Thompson. Steve, please.
Thanks, Aaron. Dr. Thompson, you talked about mutual accountabilities and not consensus. I don't necessarily see those as oppositional things. Would you say some more about what we're trying to do with that?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm okay with Lisa as well. I know everyone is here is credentialed in their own way in whatever capacity that may be. So in terms of mutual accountability and consensus, I think that often we feel that everyone needs to agree in order for us to remain in community together. Right? We see it. And I'm not saying this is easy at all, but we often feel as though everyone in the room must agree, everyone must have the same opinion, and we must align in order to live together, in order to do faith together and do life together. And often I think that gets in the way, or we see it get in the way of the risk taking we may be able to do in the name of something more. And when I talk about that idea of mutual accountability, so we might not all agree around one particular thing, or we might see it 20 different times, 20 different ways. My question is, what keeps us at the table? What keeps us at the table in conversation? And that's where mutual accountability is, comes in. Because even if I disagree with you, or even if you disagree with me in the moment, the question is, what are we both committed to? And if we can figure out what we're both committed to and accountable to, that is something that can move a conversation forward, as opposed to it just being about you being right, me being wrong. Because now we have something as a litmus test to say, for instance, that if we disagree in this moment, it's not about whether we agree or disagree at most in this moment. It's what does our agreement or disagreement or path forward create? And if we agree to be mutually accountable to this idea of sustaining life, that actually the ability to flourish is a part of the gospel promise, at the core of the gospel promise, that might keep us at the table a little longer, even if we begin with disagreement. Because then we can have a conversation about, well, is this thing in front of us prohibiting or making the idea of life abundant or sustaining life hard? Is it making it more difficult or impossible? And it becomes about us coming together on this front, on what we claim our faith tradition actually makes possible, as opposed to where we simply individually disagree because of personal preference. Quite honestly, is that helpful at all, Steve?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question.
Yeah, Steve, I mean, I think that question is particularly relevant to just the presbytery and thinking about acting in public together. I mean, think about the challenge of trying to get, hundreds of churches to be of a consensus model, as opposed to committed to living out in various ways the values that bring us together. And I think it's a different, I think what I love about what Lisa is giving us here is the centering the relationship. Even in disagreement, we are still in relationship, and not recognizing that the idea then of that prevents us, one, from acting together. At least this is sort of how I'm hearing it, Lisa. Or does it prevent us from pursuing further the collective communion of the church, which might be gathered around this notion of, no, we're still going to hold each other accountable to the values that we hold most dear, even if we disagree on this particular issue or this particular matter.
And I'm not pretending as though it's not a tough word. Yes, Steve, I'm sorry.
A quick story about something that is just happening in Columbia. We've been contacted by the Methodists and the Episcopalians, who are basically on either side of us downtown. We're all within a block of each other. And the conversation has already begun about having Bible school together this year. And the second conversation that spurred was to talk about having youth group together, which is something that, has occurred in the far distant past. But I think, the two principles that everybody's come to the table with is that we love God and we try to love each other. And so we know these people. They're people we've grown up with, just like the folks in our church are. And so that makes it a little easier, but it's really heartening coming out of a pandemic, and some of the pandemic drove these things to happen. But I think it's kind of exciting.
Yeah. Steve, you bring up the very important point, which, in other contexts I would name, in the book I name more explicitly, because often the tension arises when we have so many different folk on the spectrums of Christian traditions, right? So that we disagree about how we do communion, we disagree about how we do baptism, or we disagree about this fundamental presence, or we're more progressive, we're more moderate, and those create so many tensions. And one of the things that I attempt to do in Preaching the Headlines, and even this morning in the conversation, I want to know what unifies us, what joins us. And just what you said, it is that thread that I don't care which Christian tradition we exist in, where we claim we are on a continuum of belief, that love of God and love of neighbor is the non-negotiable mandate across traditions. And this idea, and then what we harp over and over, God's came that we may have life and have it more abundantly. And I thought, if we take these two things very seriously, that's that mutual accountability piece as opposed to consensus. Like, what would that make possible? And they seem so small, but not only if we take them seriously, if we take them concretely, right? If we concretize it in the everyday life, it may cause us to walk across the street. It may cause us to have shared Bible studies. It may cause us to even say, well, if we really claim it's love of God, love of neighbor, and life abundant, and this way in which we've interpreted the scripture for eons and eons has actually created death in our midst, we may even have to rethink that. So my push here is just what you're saying, that we have a thread throughout traditions that's very radical, if you like, and very difficult if we allow it to be. So thank you for bringing up even that example of there in Columbia.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Other questions, comments? Well, friends, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, Lisa, for just gifting us with this wisdom and the chance to work together across this presbytery. It's really been an honor to just be with you in this space, even the virtual space, right?
Thank you all for your
So,
time
yeah.
and generosity of time. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Friends, let's give Lisa a warm applause. Show your hands. But
Thank you.
yeah. And this will be recorded and be made available to the presbytery at large. So you'll be able to check in and yeah, go and be well. Yeah, enjoy the weekend, even though it's a little chilly.
Be well, friends. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.